In the frozen dawn of 1941, southern Poland lay silent under a veil of snow. To the east, the war raged across endless steppes. To the west, Germany's banners hung over occupied Europe. And in the heart of that conquered land, a place called Auschwitz began to grow, at first, a camp of brick barracks and barbed wire meant for Polish prisoners, but soon to become something else entirely. The story of Auschwitz is not only that of its victims. It is also, disturbingly, the story of ordinary German men who walked its grounds, men who obeyed orders, filled out forms, and told themselves they were serving their country. Some believed it. Others doubted but stayed silent. And a few, confronted with what they saw, were forced to face a truth darker than anything they could imagine. In the spring of 1941, SS Obersturmbannführer Rudolf Höss returned to the camp he commanded. Höss was not a monster in appearance, he was a career officer, a husband, and a father of 5. He'd served in the Great War, joined the SS in the 1930s, and now carried out Himmler's orders with mechanical precision. Under his command, Auschwitz expanded. New barracks rose from the mud. Electric fencing replaced simple barbed wire. Guard towers multiplied. To the bureaucrats in Berlin, this was efficiency, a protective custody camp operating at full capacity. To those inside, it became something far different, the center of a system that would soon industrialize death. The soldiers who arrived there, clerks, guards, medics, drivers, came from small towns across Germany. Many had no idea what awaited them. They'd been told it was a labor camp. You'll be maintaining order, their instructions said, over political prisoners and saboteurs. At first, that seemed true. Prisoners in striped uniforms labored to repair roads, drain swamps, and build new housing. But as weeks turned into months, trains began to arrive from the West, from France, from the Netherlands, from the ghettos of occupied Poland. And the men who guarded those trains began to realize that order was not what they were keeping. Among them was Oskar Groening, a young SS accountant assigned to Auschwitz in 1942. He was trained not in violence, but in finance. His job was to count and register the money taken from prisoners as they entered the camp, a seemingly administrative task. In later years, he would recall that at first, he thought of it as a matter of duty. But duty soon turned to disquiet. Groening later testified, "I heard screaming. I saw the smoke. I was told it was for the good of the rye, but I began to ask myself, if this is right, why does it feel so wrong?" He wasn't alone. Soldiers on guard duty near Birkenau, the vast expansion of Auschwitz, whispered to each other about the strange smells, the trains that arrived at night, the way entire families vanished behind brick walls and never re-emerged. One driver, Pei Broad, assigned to the political department, later described those early days with a quiet horror. "We told ourselves it was necessary. We were fighting Bolshevism." But the air told another story. Through the summer of 1942, Auschwitz transformed from a prison to a machine. The deportations increased. German logistics officers noted the efficiency of the transports, 1,000 people per train, arriving daily. Höss reported to Himmler that capacity can be increased. To the men stationed there, the transformation was visible in every detail. Where once stood open fields, new brick buildings appeared, crematoria equipped with gas-tight doors and tall chimneys. Construction units worked day and night, expanding the killing infrastructure under camouflage of military necessity. At night, the camp glowed with an orange haze. Guards standing on the perimeter could see the smoke drifting eastward. Some turned away. Others rationalized. The Waffen-SS men who rotated through guard duty spoke of special actions, a term that meant everything and nothing. They were told it was top secret, that questions were forbidden. Many obeyed. A few, like Groening, later admitted that obedience was easier than truth. In one surviving letter from a German corporal, recovered after the war, he wrote home to his wife in Bavaria, "It is quiet here, but not peaceful. I think of you and the children often. Tell the boys to study hard. They say we are doing great work for Germany. Sometimes I wonder if the world will understand what we've done when this is over." The letter never reached its destination. Allied investigators found it in the ruins of the camp in 1945. It bore no name, only a unit designation, Watch Company Auschwitz I. As 1943 arrived, the Eastern Front consumed men and material, but Auschwitz remained a priority for Berlin. Himmler visited in July, reviewing the camp personally. He congratulated Höss on the efficiency of operations. In his speech to assembled officers, he said, "You have carried out a difficult duty. History will never understand what we have done, but it will thank us for our resolve." For many of the young SS soldiers standing in that assembly, the words were confusing. They had been trained to obey, not to question. But even obedience required belief, and belief was beginning to falter. The longer they stayed, the harder it became to ignore what they saw: the endless trains, the faces at the fences, the hollow eyes of those who worked until they collapsed. A former guard later recalled, "You stopped thinking of them as people because that was the only way to endure it." Meanwhile, the camp's administrative offices thrived on paperwork. Accountants tallied confiscated valuables. Doctors filled out fitness reports. Engineers recorded the number of furnaces in operation. Bureaucracy gave structure to horror. To an outsider, the daily routine seemed almost ordinary. Roll calls, work assignments, guard rotations. But beneath that rhythm was a growing unease, an awareness that these men, though claiming ignorance, stood inside the epicenter of a crime unlike any before. Even those far from the gas chambers could not escape it. They saw the trains arrive, the luggage piled high, the silent columns led away. They saw the ash falling like snow on windless days. For some, denial became a shield. For others, doubt became unbearable. By the end of 1943, whispers circulated among German ranks. News from the front was grim: Stalingrad had fallen, and Allied bombers now reached Berlin. Some guards began to wonder what would happen when the war was lost. One SS man confided to another, "If the enemy ever comes here, they will hang us all." He wasn't wrong. Yet in the moment, the machinery of the camp continued. The men who might have spoken out stayed silent. Hoss kept his reports efficient and emotionless. The guards kept their posts. And day after day, trains continued to arrive. What began as duty had become complicity. For the German soldiers within Auschwitz, this was the turning point, when the rationalizations began to crack, when the truth became too large to ignore, and when each man faced a silent choice: obedience, denial, or conscience. The story of Auschwitz is a story of scale, but also of silence. It was not built in a day, and it was not sustained by monsters alone. It endured because men, ordinary in every sense, obeyed without question. And as 1943 turned into 1944, some among them began to realize what they had truly become a part of. For those few who tried to act, redemption would come at terrible risk. For the rest, history would judge them not for what they did, but for what they allowed to happen. The year was 1943, and the iron heart of the Reich still beat with confidence. Yet behind the front lines, far from the roar of tank engines or the cry of Stuka dive bombers, another kind of machinery was working, quieter, colder, more deliberate. Its gears turned not with oil, but with ash. For men like SS Unterscharführer P. Broad, a young German who arrived at Auschwitz in early 1943, the camp seemed at first a model of military precision. Broad was an educated man, fluent in several languages. He had joined the SS as many young men did, believing he was serving a cause of national duty. But as his boots first sank into the mud beyond the railway siding, he could sense something deeply unnatural in the air. Smoke hung low over the compound. The smell was not of fuel or damp wood, but of something he couldn't quite place. Later, he would understand. Everyone did, sooner or later. Inside the administrative barracks, Broad reported for duty to Rudolf Hoss, the camp commandant. Hoss was known for his calm demeanor and meticulous habits, a man who quoted orders as if they were scripture. His eyes revealed nothing. Broad recalled that he'd spoke of death as if it were a logistical problem. In those days, that was precisely how the system worked. By 1943, Auschwitz had become the center of Operation Reinhardt's grim purpose. The railways that spidered across Europe converged here, carrying with them cattle cars packed with men, women, and children from France, Holland, Greece, Hungary, and Poland. For most of them, Auschwitz was not a destination. It was an ending. Every morning, Broad watched the same ritual unfold. A train would roll in under the sign albeit marked "Frei," work sets you free. But for most of those who stepped onto the platform, freedom had already been taken. SS doctors and guards stood in line, sorting prisoners in moments. A wave of the hand, left for labor, right for death. The selection took minutes. The consequences lasted eternity. Many of the soldiers assigned to the platform were young, barely out of their teens. Some laughed, others smoked in silence. Orders were orders. The guards were told they were fighting partisans, saboteurs, the enemies of Europe. It was a language that numbed the conscience. Broad wrote in his later confession, "At first, I did not understand the scale of what I was part of. But soon, there was no way not to see it. Behind the fences, he saw lines of women carrying infants marching toward the low buildings at Birkenau, known officially as Buna Werk. The path wound past a grove of birch trees. From a distance, it looked peaceful. Up close, it was an illusion. That year, SS Hauptsturmführer Joseph Mengele arrived at the camp, the so-called Angel of Death. With a surgeon's hands and a scholar's charm, he brought with him the veneer of science. Broad saw him on the platform many times, calmly directing selections. He smiled often, Broad recalled, as if he were greeting guests at a reception. His clipboard was clean. His gloves spotless. Inside the camp offices, the paperwork piled high. Auschwitz was no longer just a prison, it was an industrial complex of death. Bureaucrats tracked numbers, transports, and rations with precision. For every train that arrived, a report was filed. For every 1,000 gassed, a total was entered into the ledger. Broad would later say that in Auschwitz, death was not chaos, it was order. One evening, as he filed reports by lamplight, Broad overheard a conversation between two SS officers. They spoke of Himmler's visit, how the Reichsführer himself had inspected the gas chambers and praised their efficiency. He said we were doing important work, one of them said, raising his glass. For the future of Europe. Broad went home that night to his bunk, but he could not sleep. He wrote in his journal that he had begun to hear the sounds of engines in his dreams, the low hum of diesel pumps that drove the gas into the chambers. It was a mechanical lullaby that haunted him for years. Elsewhere in the camp, another German, Oskar Groening, a young SS bookkeeper, began to wrestle with his own doubts. Groening had been a bank clerk before the war. At Auschwitz, he counted the money and valuables stripped from arriving prisoners. He never fired a gun, never struck a prisoner, but he knew exactly what was happening outside the counting room walls. One morning, as he stood by the railway ramp, Groening witnessed what he later called the day the illusion broke. A guard seized a baby from a young mother who refused to let go. Without hesitation, the guard grabbed the infant by the legs and smashed its skull against the side of a truck. Groening froze. That was when I knew, he later confessed, that I was part of something evil. He asked for a transfer, but it was denied. The SS needed men who would not ask questions. So he stayed, and the paperwork continued. As 1943 turned to 1944, the tempo increased. The Hungarian deportations began, over 400,000 Jews in just 8 weeks. The crematoria burned day and night. At times, the smoke turned the sky over Birkenau red. Prisoners were forced to shovel ash into the nearby river. Even some of the guards began to speak in whispers, fearful that Germany was losing not just the war, but its soul. Rudolf Höss himself was temporarily reassigned that year, but his replacement, Arthur Lieber Henschel, tried, in his own limited way, to impose a trace of humanity. He ordered the beatings reduced and some conditions improved. But the machinery of death was beyond any single man's control. Orders still came from Berlin. Trains still arrived. In one report, Broad noted a curious detail: Allied aircraft had been spotted high overhead, contrails streaking the sky. For the first time, the war beyond the fences was drawing near. Distant thunder echoed through the nights, artillery, perhaps, or bombs falling on German soil. The men of the SS began to sense that the world outside was changing, that perhaps retribution was coming. But still, the trains came. Inside the officers' barracks, the men drank more heavily. Some laughed, others stared silently into their cups. A few muttered that the Führer's grand empire was crumbling. Yet the orders never changed. On one bitter January morning in 1944, Broad accompanied a convoy to the gas chambers under the pretext of inspection. He watched as the doors closed, the engine started, and the muffled pounding began. The noise lasted for minutes, then silence. The doors opened, and the Sonderkommando moved in, Jewish prisoners forced to clear the bodies. Broad stood motionless. There was no room for imagination, he later said. The truth was in front of our eyes. That night, he wrote a letter home, one of the few that survived the war. He told his family that he was doing his duty for Germany and that life was difficult but necessary. What he didn't say was that he had stopped believing it. By mid-1944, the horizon of the Reich had darkened. News filtered through the Guards' radios: Allied forces had landed in Normandy. The Red Army was advancing from the east. For the first time, even the most devoted among them began to realize the Third Reich was dying. But Auschwitz lived on. Broad noticed new construction near Birkenau, more fences, more watchtowers. Himmler's orders were clear: the solution must continue, faster than ever. Panic drove efficiency. By summer, the camp's capacity reached its grim peak, over 9,000 people killed per day. At night, the guards could see the glow from the crematoria reflected in the clouds. The air was thick, heavy, and unbreathable. Some said it smelled like burnt sugar. Others said it was the smell of Germany's conscience. And still, they worked. Still, they filed reports. Still, the trains rolled in. The men who had once seen themselves as soldiers now moved like shadows. They no longer spoke of victory. Only survival. Pay Broad, Oskar Groening, and hundreds like them would one day face the question that haunted post-war Germany: how much did you know? And why did you do nothing? At Auschwitz in 1944, there were no good answers, only silence, and the sound of the engines running through the night. By January 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. The Red Army had crossed the Vistula, racing west through snow-choked plains toward Krakow. Every German commander knew the Eastern Front was lost. Yet few understood what that meant for the network of camps scattered across occupied Poland. Inside the SS command structure, orders came down from Berlin: evacuate the camps, destroy evidence, move prisoners west. In reality, it was chaos. Transports broke down, guards fled, and blizzards swallowed entire convoys of half-starved men and women. At Auschwitz, Commandant Richard Bayer tried to follow procedure, burn files, dismantle the gas chambers, erase the traces. But it was too late. The Soviets were only days away. On January 27, 1945, reconnaissance units of the 322nd Rifle Division crossed the wire. They found silence, smoke, and 15,000 prisoners still alive among corpses and ash. The Soviets had not come looking for a concentration camp, they expected an enemy strongpoint. Instead, they walked into a landscape of systematic murder. Photographers and medical officers documented everything. Their reports, smuggled to London and Washington, would soon redefine the meaning of the war itself. For the German soldiers retreating west, the name Auschwitz was barely spoken. In diaries recovered later, infantrymen wrote of strange camps and civilian facilities they'd passed. Few grasped the scale. But as Allied broadcasts began describing death factories, disbelief turned to fear. In April 1945, the Western Allies reached Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen. Combat cameramen filmed the scenes, and within weeks those images were shown in newsreels across the United States. At home, American audiences, veterans, families, men who'd fought through the Ardennes, watched in stunned silence. This, they realized, was what the war had really been about. Among the captured Germans were men who had served at Auschwitz: Oskar Groening, a clerk, Joseph Kramer, known as the Beast of Belsen, and Rudolf Hoss, the camp's first commandant. Each would soon stand before Allied tribunals. Hoss was caught hiding under a false name on a farm near Flensburg. Interrogators from the British military police brought him to Nuremberg, where he calmly described the operation of Auschwitz in precise, bureaucratic terms. His words, later read aloud at the International Military Tribunal, chilled even the prosecutors: "I commanded Auschwitz until December 1943, and estimate that at least 2.5 million people were exterminated there by gassing and burning. Another 500,000 died of starvation and disease." It was not emotion, but methodical efficiency that stunned the courtroom. Hoss spoke as if reciting production figures. Yet his testimony became one of the most important pieces of evidence at Nuremberg. As Germany surrendered in May 1945, soldiers returning from the front lines faced a shattered nation and a moral reckoning unlike anything in modern history. The Allies forced local populations to walk through nearby camps. In Weimar, American soldiers marched townspeople through Buchenwald's gates. In Ludwigsburg, French troops made villagers bury the dead. For many Germans, it was the first time they saw what their government had done in their name. Newsreel footage from that spring shows grey-haired men removing their hats, women turning away, young boys staring at the camera with disbelief. These were the faces of a nation confronting truth. Meanwhile, in Washington and London, generals and politicians debated what to do with the evidence. President Truman insisted the world must see. General Eisenhower, visiting Ohrdruf camp, ordered every detail filmed. "Let the world see what I have seen," he said. "Someday someone will say this never happened." He was right. Within years, denial began to surface among those unwilling to believe the extent of the crime. By the late 1940s, the trials expanded. In Krakow, the Supreme National Tribunal of Poland convicted 23 former Auschwitz staff. Hoss was among them. In April 1947, he was hanged at the site of the camp he had commanded. Oskar Groening, then a young SS clerk, would live quietly in Germany until the 21st century, when he was finally tried in 2015. His defense, that he was only a bookkeeper, was rejected. The court ruled that knowing participation in the mechanism of death was enough. These proceedings closed the military chapter of the war, but opened another, the long process of memory. As the 1950s dawned, Germany rebuilt from ruins. The camps became memorials, the testimonies, textbooks. Yet for many Germans who had worn the uniform, the war remained a private ghost. Diaries recovered decades later reveal shame, disbelief, and a desperate need to distance oneself from the system that had made such horror possible. Some wrote that they had no idea. Others admitted they had heard whispers but chosen silence. For historians, those words became vital evidence of how an advanced nation had compartmentalized moral responsibility. In that sense, Auschwitz was not only a physical place, it was a mirror. It reflected what happens when obedience replaces conscience, when ideology eclipses humanity. Today, the ruins of Auschwitz stand preserved. The barbed wire, the watchtowers, the silent barracks, all remain as reminders. American veterans who visited after the war often described the same reaction, an inability to comprehend how such a place existed within the same war they'd fought for liberation. For them, the beaches of Normandy, the Ardennes, and Iwo Jima were battles for survival. Auschwitz revealed the moral dimension. As one former GI put it in 1946, we thought we were fighting for freedom. Then we saw what the Nazis did. That's when we realized we'd been fighting for humanity itself. As the guns fell silent across Europe in May 1945, the world began to reckon not only with the destruction of cities and armies but with the moral catastrophe left in the wake of Auschwitz and the network of Nazi concentration camps. Soldiers who had fought across the beaches of Normandy, the forests of the Ardennes, and the islands of the Pacific were now confronted with a reality far darker than any battlefield. What they saw at the camps reshaped the understanding of war itself. American troops entering Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen recorded their shock in letters and diaries. They described skeletal survivors, piles of belongings stripped from victims, and rooms that smelled of death and decay. Veterans who had endured the chaos of combat now faced scenes that were beyond the comprehension of their wartime experience. As one officer noted, "We had faced death on every battlefield, but here death had been organized, systematic, industrial. It was different. Terrifyingly different." In the immediate post-war months, the Allies faced an unprecedented challenge, documenting the crimes of the Third Reich. Thousands of files, photographs, and testimonies had to be gathered. Survivors recounted experiences in harrowing detail, providing both the names of perpetrators and the sequence of atrocities. For German personnel who had served in the camps, men like Oskar Groening, Rudolf Höss, and hundreds of lower-ranking SS officers, the truth could no longer be hidden. The Nuremberg trials, beginning in November 1945, became the defining moment of post-war justice. Here, leaders of the Reich were tried not for battlefield defeats but for crimes against humanity. Rudolf Höss's testimony was pivotal. Calm, methodical, and chillingly precise, he outlined the operation of Auschwitz, the deportations, the selections, the gas chambers, and the crematoria. His detailed account provided irrefutable proof of systematic extermination. Even those who had avoided direct violence could not escape accountability. Oskar Groening, the bookkeeper of Auschwitz, had spent years tallying valuables stolen from incoming prisoners. Though he never fired a weapon, his work facilitated the machinery of death. In 2015, decades later, the German courts held him responsible, emphasizing a central principle: knowledge and participation in a system designed to kill were enough to warrant conviction. Beyond the courtroom, the liberation of the camps brought a moral imperative to the Allies and the world. Images of emaciated survivors, piles of possessions, and scorched earth were widely circulated. In the United States, newspapers printed photographs of Auschwitz, and American veterans spoke publicly about the camps, creating an awareness that stretched far beyond the European theater. Historian and journalist accounts from the period emphasize the collective shock experienced by the public, including older generations who had fought in World War I and now faced the realization of human capacity for cruelty on a scale previously unimaginable. The camps themselves became sites of memory and education. In Poland, the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial and Museum was established, preserving barracks, watchtowers, crematoria, and rail lines. Visitors walk through these preserved structures not merely to view history, but to experience the scale and methodology of the atrocities. They are confronted with the reality that such systematic evil was made possible by ordinary people following orders, bureaucrats signing papers, and soldiers maintaining discipline in the service of ideology. In Germany, the process of reckoning was slower and more fraught. For decades, a combination of denial, silence, and selective memory permeated public discourse. Families of perpetrators often struggled to reconcile the actions of fathers and grandfathers with their own understanding of morality and patriotism. Scholars and educators gradually worked to integrate the lessons of the Holocaust into public education. By the late 20th century, it became a central component of historical curricula, emphasizing not only the atrocities themselves but the societal conditions, obedience, ideology, indifference that allowed them to occur. The psychological burden on former SS personnel was immense. Diaries, letters, and post-war interviews reveal a mixture of fear, shame, and attempts at rationalization. Some claimed ignorance, others expressed regret, yet all were haunted by the knowledge that they had been witnesses, if not participants, in crimes that defied comprehension. Pei Broad, for example, spent decades reflecting on his role at Auschwitz, ultimately providing historians with detailed memoirs that remain essential sources for understanding the internal mechanics of the camp system. Internationally, the post-war period saw the establishment of organizations and tribunals dedicated to documenting genocide and crimes against humanity. The United Nations passed the Genocide Convention in 1948, a direct response to the Holocaust. The lessons learned from Auschwitz informed both the legal frameworks for prosecuting war crimes and the global commitment to prevent such atrocities in the future. For American veterans who had fought across Europe, the memory of the camps became inseparable from their wartime service. Men who had stormed Omaha Beach or held defensive positions in the Ardennes now saw their sacrifices in a new light, not simply as a fight against an invading army, but as part of a struggle to preserve human dignity in the face of calculated, systematic evil. Memoirs from these veterans consistently highlight the shock and moral responsibility felt upon encountering the camps, and the enduring drive to ensure the world would never forget. By the 1960s and 1970s, survivors and liberators alike had begun publishing extensive accounts. Books such as Night by Elie Wiesel and the collected testimonies of camp survivors brought personal voices to the historical record, humanizing statistics into stories of struggle, resilience, and the enduring consequences of hatred. German personnel who remained alive were occasionally interviewed, their accounts supplementing the testimony of victims and providing historians with insight into how ideology, obedience, and routine bureaucratic procedures enabled mass murder. The final decades of the 20th century and the first decades of the 21st have seen continuous reflection on Auschwitz and the Holocaust. Museums, memorials, and educational programs around the world ensure that the scale of human cruelty and the mechanisms by which it was carried out are never forgotten. Documentary films, cinematic recreations, and scholarly work emphasize both the operational details and the moral questions posed by the camps. Audiences are confronted with the uncomfortable truth: such evil was not perpetrated by mythical monsters alone, but by ordinary humans who followed orders, rationalized atrocities, and looked away. Today, the story of Auschwitz and the German personnel who maintained it serves as a warning. It underscores the fragility of civilization and the importance of vigilance against ideology that dehumanizes. It reminds us that memory is moral, that documentation is responsibility, and that history demands both attention and reflection. The men who served in the SS at Auschwitz, whether clerks, guards, or commandants, ultimately confronted a reality far beyond the reach of ideology, the understanding that they had been part of a system that attempted to annihilate millions of lives. For the world, the liberation of Auschwitz was a moral turning point. It transformed the understanding of warfare, occupation, and the human capacity for cruelty. It reminded the Allied soldiers, policymakers, and civilians alike that victory in battle is hollow without justice, accountability, and the acknowledgement of truth. The reverberations of that recognition continue today, in classrooms, in courts, in museums, and in the conscience of every generation that seeks to understand the depths of the Second World War. As memorials stand in Poland, in Germany, and across the world, they testify not only to the lives lost but to the responsibilities of those who survive. They compel reflection on the capacity for ordinary individuals to contribute to extraordinary evil and the enduring duty of humanity to confront it, remember it, and prevent it. Auschwitz, and the German soldiers who once served there, are now part of a historical record that transcends individual guilt or shame. They are part of a chronicle of human history, a stark, undeniable reminder that morality, courage, and conscience must guide even in the most organized systems of violence.